your mics.
Welcome everyone. We're going to have a special guest today, and let's go right into the introduction of Mike A. Barron. How you doing, Mike?
Good.
That's good. We have a few other people here. Why don't everyone tell us who you are and where you can be found? Start with Chester.
Hey everybody, my name is Chester C. Busby III, and I have a channel named Chester Busby, of course, which is home of Fanspeak. Feel free to head over, and I'm sure the links will drop, and you're more than welcome. We are every day talking to fans about comic books.
How about you, Chris? Why don't you tell us where you can be found?
Mostly I'm on just Twitter right now at Last Snow Leopard, and I have Pinterest, but it's not been updated enough lately, so it's kind of useless to share that.
And also joining us today is Tank Ferret, who you're probably sure you know from all the other shows that he's on, and I'm so glad he came because Tank's art is a favorite of mine. Tank, why don't you tell everyone where they can find you?
Thank you, John. You guys can find me at Tank Ferret Art at Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And you can also find me often with Chester Busby or Good Dog Press or here with Todd Mulrooney.
All right, so why don't we get right into it, Mike? We'd be remiss if we didn't do this right here at the beginning. Obviously, yesterday was the passing of a legendary Stan Lee, and I'm sure you must have some reflection or some story or something that you could share with us. What Stan Lee meant to you, maybe your first meeting. I'd love to hear this kind of stuff.
I met Stan Lee in 1972 when I interviewed him for Cream magazine. And that interview is available too. I posted it on my page. But Stan was always a gentleman. After I started writing for Marvel in the 80s, I would run into him again and again at conventions, especially the San Diego Comic-Con. Each time I'd say, Stan, you don't know me, but I write one of your comics. And he'd say, sure I do, sure I do. How are you doing? He was always a great guy, friendly guy. Of course, he revolutionized the comic book industry primarily through his writing. Until that point, most of the superhero titles were played for laughs. They were silly. And with Spider-Man and other characters like Doc Strange, for example, he brought a new seriousness of purpose to the writing. It's not to say it was Shakespeare, but it was serious in the sense that he took the story seriously. He imagined them out without jokes. He followed the premise to its end. And readers could sense that this was a new level of commitment. And the proof was that the comics were more entertaining. And that launched, I don't know whether you call it the Golden Age or the Silver Age, but the first rush of Marvel when they were doing Fantastic Four #1 and the Thing #1 and the Hulk and the Thor and the Avengers. That whole period was one of tremendous excitement.
You're kind of alluding to a difference, because there was a difference at the time that this all began. There was a huge difference between DC Comics and Marvel Comics, and that wasn't necessarily the artwork, but it was the writing. Why don't you talk a little bit about that, how different they were?
I wasn't the greatest connoisseur of that era at DC, but anybody who remembers, and I don't know why they would, because this stuff is really old, but silly Superman stories. Mr. Mxyzptlk, who was a little demon that bugged Superman, but stories where Lois suddenly becomes Superman, or that had kind of a low rent, famous romance aspect to them. Superman falling in love with a gorilla. Now, I don't know if this happened, but those were the types of stories. And you saw it on the covers. I think they called it the Mort Weisinger era, because Mort was the editor at DC at that time who liked that sort of thing. Whereas over on Marvel, they were saving the universe from Galactus, and they're fighting off uh, the mole people and the mole man, Doctor Octopus, and Doctor Doom. Those guys weren't funny villains; they were serious, scary villains within the confines of the comic world. So Marvel kind of got a leg up by taking their stories more seriously.
You also mentioned Shakespeare, and one of the things that Stanley did is sort of created the villain to be more boisterous, more fantastic than the actual hero. So he drew you into the story as far as watch out what happens next and this kind of a thing. He used a certain kind of a language to draw you in the reader in, including on the cover. Would you say this really was the part of the success of these comics was the villains more so than even the heroes at times?
Not so much the villains, but what you point to is Stan's style, the funky Flashman style, which was a
Right.
character that Jack Kirby created based on Stan that highlighted his P.T. Barnum like elements, because Stan was a showman and he knew how to sell product. And you didn't do it by hiding your light on your under a hat. You know, he'd get right out and say, "This is the most important story you're going to read all the year," and every comic was like that. This is the most important comic. How will they survive this? The whole fate of Earth is in the balance. It wasn't silly stuff. It was serious stuff within the confines of the comic book universe, and Stan knew how to sell it. There was nobody at DC like that, and Stan had a relationship with the readers through the pages. And Stan's soapbox, and he loved alliteration. You know, he loved that kind of language that the pulps used in the 50s and 60s, with a lot of alliteration and a lot of bombastic language. There's a video on the internet. It's called Five Guys in a Limo, and everyone should watch it, especially writers, because it's five of the best voiceover artists in Hollywood getting in a limo to go to an awards ceremony. And each time they introduce one, you hear this stentorian voice say, "In a world where no man dares to stand against the board, one man stands tall." No, I don't have the voice for it, but you get the idea of what these guys are like. And Stan was like that. He knew how to sell stuff. He had that voice, whether you actually heard him speaking it or you just looked at his words, you got that resonance. This was important. This was bombast.
Now,
Mm.
I learned recently, and this kind of blew my mind, that you actually entered comics as an illustrator. Talk a little
Oh,
bit
no,
about
no, no,
that.
I can't draw. I tried for years.
Yeah, but your
But
first piece was an illustrated piece for Kitchen Sink Press.
well, I didn't illustrate it. I worked with a couple of great illustrators at the time, Rand Holmes, notably. That thing with the water pistol, I didn't make that illustration.
Oh no.
No.
Now, what would you consider your first big break or your first introduction to the world as you as a writer for comics?
Well, it was Nexus. Steve and I just lucked out. We met up and started working on this, and we were in the right place at the right time when Capital City Distribution, which was the second largest comic book distributor in the world with warehouses in many different countries, they decided they wanted to do their own comics. So I cooked up Nexus, and dude illustrated the first 12 pages and showed it to them, and they said, yeah. And so we were off and running.
That's one thing I will touch upon later, distribution. But let's go back to Nexus. So, what was how was it received when it initially came out, Nexus?
The response was much bigger than I expected. We got a lot of attention. People loved the story, they loved the art. It was something new and fresh. And we maintained a very high level of storytelling for 20 years with that, most of which is available in reprints and hardbound volumes from Dark Horse.
I didn't want to go back and sort of reread or read any synopsis of Nexus. I wanted to sort of give my reflection on what I remember from Nexus. All right, now the main character was. Why don't you tell me what kind of superhero he was, or what kind of a costume adventurer he was?
He was the reluctant executioner of mass murderers, chosen by an insane alien to be the conscience of his race. And there's this whole backstory about how his father was a military dictator for the Sov Empire, and his father was responsible for mass murders on a huge level. And that in his last job, he decided to blow the planet up because they were rebelling and they wouldn't listen to him and he couldn't control it. So, in order to save Vredic, he had to destroy Vredic. And then the dad and the mom, who was pregnant, got in a ship and went through a black hole because he thought, well, we'll just kill ourselves. You know, there's nothing more to live for. This is how I choose to go out. But the black hole spewed them out in a different part of the galaxy, and they found the deserted planet of Ilum, which was very hospitable to human life. And so General Hellpop, Nexus' father, moved into an apartment there, which had been standing. It's all very Zen-like and comic booky, of course, and I don't know how they're going to do it in the movie, but they did this. And young Horatio, as he was named, he was born on this planet, grew up with no parental guidance whatsoever. His father was constantly depressed and suicidal, and his mother was insane. The only friends he had were these two semi-transparent aliens, Elf and Beta, who would come to him and play with him. They looked alike. They were sexless, but they knew the planet and they showed him around and they helped instruct him in a whole bunch of things. And it turns out that these were the subconscious manifestations of the insane alien who had guided them there in the first place. And you didn't get to the alien for 2 years, and then you discover, well, this is where his power comes from. It's this insane aliens sitting in the middle of the planet who's decided that he's going to choose a champion to be the conscience of the human race. And the way he's going to do it is he's going to endow this champion with all sorts of powers and send him out to assassinate mass murderers. That was his thing. It's not a bad thing. If you got to kill somebody, why not a mass murderer? But Nexus was reluctant. He didn't want to go. He had to go because he would dream about them. And if he didn't go, the dreams would become more and more intense until eventually they would drive him mad. And that's the premise. And it started from there. But there was so much more to it. Duke kept adding these background characters who looked very appealing and they were doing funny things. So I'd bring them forward and I'd give them a few lines. And before you knew it, we had a cast of thousands.
So, but you touched upon it really wasn't the conventional fare as far as superheroes went. In light of what was going on at the times. But some of your villains weren't conventional either. Sometimes they were like CEOs or big heads of corporation, or what was wasn't there a lounge singer?
I can't remember the lounge singer. Of course, there's Clone Zone. He's the lounge singer. But yes, I was like a lot of writers. I'm influenced by current events and what I see around me. And I started with military dictators. And in fact, most of his targets are military dictators. But there were other mass murderers as well, including garden variety sociopaths, private characters who just killed for the fun of it. And in one issue, he takes on Jack the Ripper. That's pretty recent. Dark Horse issued that as a trade paperback a couple years back called Into the Past and Other Stories. And there were a few corporate honchos who were irresponsible and knowingly caused thousands of deaths to make a buck.
There was also a politician that was pretty prevalent in this whole series. Talk a little bit about this guy. I don't know.
You'd have to name him. My mind is a sieve these days. I can't remember everything.
I purposely didn't look so that I could sort of reflect on it.
Keep telling me I'm losing my memory.
He sort of had a banner across him, like what do they call that when you win a prize or you win like?
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah. I just couldn't tell you. I mean, there are like 150 issues of Nexus, and and I'm always working on new stuff constantly, and that's where my mind is. I'm working on 4 different projects right now, and I'm thinking, what do I have to do here and there? If you showed me the pages, I'd be able to tell you.
That's fine. You just mentioned something that really gets me excited. You mentioned the Nexus movie. Can you tell us a little bit about what you can say about that?
Well, there's always hope, and we do have some interest. But right now, there's no Nexus movie, and there won't be a Nexus movie until I have a signed contract. But yes, there is some interest and there is some activity. But that happens all the time in Hollywood. Over 10,000 different projects, only 6 of which ever get made. So it's pointless to get all worked up over something until we have an actual deal.
Anyone else here have any questions about the Nexus period of Mike's career? Do you have? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well,
Tim.
you know, the professional. I like to talk about the professional environment back then, because that's when I was a kid and I was hanging out with Julia Schwartz behind the scenes, and I was just observing how things went on. And you know, back then, absolutely hated each other and disagreed. But when it came down to it, they put on a smiling face for the fans, and they put out a good product. Am I accurate in my observation there?
About whom?
Well, about most, you know, when it came down to the professional atmosphere, when it came towards the public face. You know, behind the scenes, these guys could be like snarling it at each other's throats, but when it came out, oh, look, here's the comic book to present at the convention. We have to put on the public face. They put on the public face for a company.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's all sorts of crazy shit that goes on at a comic company. I don't know, because
Oh, yeah. It happens in any environment.
I didn't work at the comic company. I've always been a freelancer. I always worked out of my home. And I'd go in there and hang out at the companies from time to time. But you know, I didn't see people fighting each other.
No, they just wouldn't hang out with each other after work.
You know, I just had dinner with Larry Hama Saturday night, and he was telling me about the old days at Marvel, and just it was fascinating stuff about how they all worked there. He worked for Jim Shooter and stuff that went on there. And Larry would be a good guy to have on your show because he can tell you all about that.
I'd
that'd be
love
awesome.
to have him. Yeah, I'd love to have him. I'm not so sure he would do it because he's sort of he keeps quiet. I mean, when he says something, he says something. But I kind of wonder if he'd do it. But I'll definitely give him a shout out at some point and ask him. I certainly would love to do that.
He's an easygoing guy. He's very approachable.
Oh,
So
that's cool.
do you
Yeah, it
have
was.
any questions for him, Chester, about
Oh, yeah,
Nexus?
sure. Yeah, no, I enjoyed Nexus quite a bit. I think I'm probably a bigger Badger fan than I am Nexus, but I did read both of them. And just a quick question on the mentioning of with Shooter. Exactly how tall was he?
Jim is he's at least 6'6". I've met him a couple of times.
Ooh,
He's up there. The 3 tallest guys in comics are Shooter, Steve Rude, and Mike Richardson.
Steve Root is tall.
And
Wow.
Steve Leialoha is very tall too.
Because we
And
were looking at a
Dennis
Real-
Kitchen. Dennis Kitchen. Now those 5 guys could form a basketball team.
Right.
In
Dennis
fact,
Kitchen was
Richardson played basketball in college.
Oh, I did.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, because we were looking at a picture yesterday in our memorial for Stan Lee, and it was a comic Marvel Age cover, and it had Stan standing on his soapbox as usual, and Shooter was standing next to him, but he was even though Stan was on the box, he was just towering over him, which I guess kind of made the idea that Stan was real short guy.
No, Stan was like 5'9" or 5'10".
I see.
I wonder if he did that
But
sort of out of like I'm gonna be the tallest guy in the room, so my voice is gonna, my voice might not be the loudest, but you're gonna listen. I wonder if he sort of did that as a sort of a good management skill. Anyway, let's go on to Badger, right? So Badger, there's an overlap here with Nexus and Badger at Dark Horse, And what year did Badger start?
83.
And what kind of tell us what kind of character Badger was to the
Well,
to
I
the
went in there. I said, well, let's get another title going. And my friend Jeff Butler had drawn, which I had written. I had written this 10-page story about a druid wizard in Wales who was so obnoxious that the other wizards decided to put him in a coma and drop him off the face of the earth. So I went in there and they said, "What do you got?" And I said, "Well, I got this druid wizard." And Milton, who was head of the organization, "No, give us a costume crime fighter." So I said, well, I asked myself, why would anybody put on a costume and fight crime? They'd have to be crazy. And right away I said, yeah, that's it. You know, that's the angle. And I'd been reading the Minds of Billy Milligan by Daniel Keyes, one of the first serious studies of multiple personalities. And that was it. I said, well, I'll make him a multiple personality. And then I was walking down State Street in my hometown of Madison and was Badger Liquors, Badger Poster, the Badger Pub, and then it hit me. He was the Badger. And so that's how it all kind of came together.
the I don't I read the Badger. I don't remember a lot about it as much as I read almost everything Nexus. There was even a while there that you allowed other people to write Nexus stories and other artists came in. I think it was called Nexus Avengers, correct?
Uh, what was that guy's name? I can't remember his name. Yeah, that wasn't my idea. First had this other writer that they wanted to give a shot and they thought that they could sell it. And my attitude is, if I can help another writer, that's fine. So I had no problem. Now with the Badger, I dragged my friend Roger Salick into it, and Roger wrote a couple of issues. Roger runs a karate studio in Delafield, Wisconsin. And he'd also been writing for magazines too. Uh, and Roger wrote some good stories, but he was not a professional writer. He's still running that studio too.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Now, is there any chance? Obviously, Badger, you recently did something with Badger in the last
yeah,
2 years.
yeah.
Want to tell
Well,
us?
we have a new story that we're going to crowdfund in the spring. It's all written. It's going to be a standalone 48-page story in which Badger competes in the Iditarod, which is the Alaskan dog race that happens between Fairbanks and Nome. It's 1,000 miles through wilderness. Uh, and there's also a giant cockroach.
Wow.
Yeah, and we have a great artist for that. Jeff Slemons is his name, and I hope to have some art to post shortly. But we're going to crowdfund that. With any luck, we'll get that out next year.
No, that sounds great. I'm a big Badger fan, as I told you before, and I've read all of them. So I'm looking forward to the next one.
Oh, thank
Uh,
you.
I love the insanity of Badger. It's awesome.
Did you read the most recent series? It was a couple of years
Uh,
ago.
yeah, I know. I saw some new stuff a couple of years ago. I don't know if it was two, maybe it was 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah,
I don't
Ray Fitz.
remember. Yeah, no. I every time Badger comes up, I read it. I'm looking
Okay,
forward to it, man.
thank you.
The other thing about this period I want to talk about, because you were an indie creator, right? You're talking about being a freelance, and
Yeah,
you started out this way. You eventually worked your way over through probably through accolades and things like that were happening with Badger and Nexus that got you mainstream work. But I want to talk a bit about the health of the industry at the time of these books has a lot to do, like you mentioned, capital. Now we're going back to a time when there was, I believe, three really big distribution chains. Obviously, there was Capital, there was
Diamond.
Diamond, and then there was like a middle of the country guy who was also really good to independents. But a lot of people think the downfall of comics is content and things like that. And when you have a Batman reader, I kind of think if you give them a decent enough story, they'll always be a Batman reader. But I don't really necessarily blame politics or agendas as the downfall. I would say accessibility. Why don't you talk a little bit about the health of indie comics then, and then when that started to change as Diamond made their move?
Well, I'm no expert on this. Milton Greep is an expert. He discusses it all the time on his website, icv2.com. But it's not healthy for the industry that there's only one channel of distribution. And I don't blame Steve Geppi. I'm not certain how this all happened, but it did happen. And what once was a solution is now a problem. I'm talking about the dedicated comic shop. Until the dedicated comic shop came along, you got your comics wherever you could, in grocery stores or drugstores, and you could never be certain of getting what you wanted. Then along comes the comic shop, and it's a shop entirely devoted to comics, and it was a revolution in the industry at the time, because you could go to one place and get everything you wanted and order everything you want. That's all changed drastically now because comic shops have such thin margins that they don't order everything, and there are far too many titles for them to carry. So a lot of stuff just never gets any decent distribution. But that's only part of the problem. There's a much bigger problem, which is a whole generation of kids that aren't reading comics. And I think a lot of it is due to the rise of video games. And the fact is that your average video game is far more entertaining than your average comic. I know because I read comics from time to time. I'm not the reader I was once, but whenever I pick up a new title from one of the big two, I'm generally appalled at the complete waste of money and the lack of storytelling. You flip through that thing in 5 minutes and there's no story. Look at Marvel. The first thing you do when you open the first thing you see when you open the cover is a page of type, bringing you up to speed and giving the credits and explaining all this stuff, when you should be seeing a splash page where the story starts. And by splash page, I don't necessarily mean a single image, but usually you have a big image, and sometimes a big image with a couple of small
insets or something like that. Yeah.
Story starts there on page one. But when I look through Marvel Comics or DC Comics, it's 2 pages of story and then 2 pages of ads, then 2 pages of story. And that's one thing that comics like Image or Dark Horse or Dynamite have all over the big two, is that they're not necessarily beholden to those ads, which break up the continuity. Not that that's a big thing. It's not a big deal. If the story were compelling, it would not be a big deal. But there are very few compelling titles out there these days.
What bothers me about the ads they put in the comics is so many of them are for other Marvel comics or a later issue of the comic you're reading. And it's like you're not even earning money on those. It just seems like it's they needed an extra 2 minutes of a TV show, so they just put in a sight gag, and it doesn't make sense as far as a business model of why you would even waste printing that. I understand you have to advertise everything, but you could do that on 2 pages, because I remember in the past, if they had an ad in there and they were telling you about what's going on, it's dramatic. You actually want to read that comic.
Yeah, well, I got no problem with ads in comics. I like it when they're all crammed together at the end of the story and not breaking up the story, but I can understand about that too. But I don't get the economics of the ads, so I'm no expert on that. I don't know if they do any good or not.
Who handled the ads when you were first starting out? Like, that's something that Dark Horse strictly handled, or did you have any say in anything like that?
Well, it was a couple of years before we got to Dark Horse, and
Right.
no, we had no say in that. But as far as I know, Dark Horse only advertises Dark Horse products.
Right.
It's not like Marvel or DC that are advertising snack candy,
Chef Boyardee, right.
TV shows or whatever. And those are good ads. I'd love to get some of those ads in our independent comics. Of course, we would cram them all at the back.
I mean, shouldn't that be something that's possible? I mean,
yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yes, it is possible, and nobody's done it. But I'm thinking of doing it, especially here in Colorado, where we got a lot of marijuana money, boys.
Oh,
marijuana money. Yeah, they'll take an ad out of anything that moves.
Now,
Yeah.
I was alluding to sort of Diamond buying Capital. I forget the name of this Midwestern distribution house. I think it had sort of an acronym for a name. but he was really generous to indie creators. But this really put, I mean, when that went away, it almost seems like it coincides with the health of a lot of independent books.
Well, they're a tough sell these days, and as I mentioned before, one of the reasons is they're getting precious little display in current comic shops, which are struggling to stay alive because the readership hasn't grown in 30 years. Uh, Plus, you got digital comics. I don't know what effect those have on paper sales. I suspect they're not that much, except that you've got a whole generation that's used to reading their comics digitally, and they're not in the habit of buying paper product at all. In other words, they're not collectors. So the comics are missing out on those sales. But the paper comic will never disappear because, as we all know, a comic book is words and pictures printed on paper, something you hold in your hand. People love it, and because they love it, it will be around forever, regardless of whether it's ever big business or not.
Yeah, I personally think that they made a big mistake going digital, because what they did was they showed people that you can do that. Because we talk about here a lot on our channels about how the comic book industry is faltering, and we know there's a lot more to it than simply people aren't interested. People have simply left because of the content and the absolute forced politics. But if you go to a certain segment of the internet, you'll find these things called web comics. And web comics are extremely healthy. There are literally millions of people who interact and read them every day. So there is a market. It's not that there aren't people who aren't interested in comic books. They're just not interested in what is being offered by the big companies. And I think there needs to be a big push, kind of things like Peter Samedi over at Alterna Comics is doing, by trying to get things back into places like Walmart, into the drugstores, into other places, to get these comics into the young generation's hands, which has been absolutely and completely neglected by people like Marvel and DC. And I don't know why they did that. But my point is there is a market. And I think when it comes down to it, having a comic book in your hand, having that paper between your fingers is what the tactile aspect of comic books is something that's very important. And I'd really like to see the people here in the indies start really pushing that again and try to get a hold of that web comic market and bring them back into the paper comic book.
Yeah, and speaking of expanding markets, I would absolutely and totally play a third-person action adventure RPG played Nexus through the Nexus storyline. Open world, that would be an incredible game. I would also download Badger Run. You know, those little temple run games with Badger. Tell me that it's I as a consumer, as a fan, I would totally be interested in products like this. So you know, comics are fantastic, and it's a wonderful medium, and we need to continue to do this because they are the gateway to higher levels of literacy. But consider a general opportunities that we can take in the digital age that, with a good crowdfunding, you can get something off the ground pretty cheap.
That's true.
What I would like is if Marvel and DC would actually go back into their print issues. I know they're doing stuff like with Infinity War, but where if they just went back to old newsprint paper, simple paper for everything, keep the cost down, and just start putting out older issues that like talk to the people who've been in the industry for decades and go, what series like brought you into comics, and reprint those and put them on spinner racks and 7-Elevens. I don't know how many 7-Elevens are left, but at gas stations, stuff like that. Get them in where you have a kid who'd walk into the corner gas station and they just grab an issue for $1 or $1.50, even $2. But it would be something where all of a sudden you're generating that thing, because it's just like video games. You have to start the bar low and build up. You can't just have the most Michael Bay thing at the first thing they see, because that's all they're going to be after, is that same impression they got with that initial.
Yeah, well, you're talking about newsprint, and yeah, of course, like I said, Alterna is doing that. But yeah, the problem is, that would be the smart move. But as we've seen with these companies, they won't do the smart move. They won't get these older guys involved because they don't have the right politic. They don't think right, and they've made it very, very clear that they don't want anything to do with that. Now, this is going to be their downfall. And that's why this indie revival is going on. And this is something perfect for Mr. Barron to talk about here, because he is very important to indie comics, I feel. And that's what's going on over here with us, is pushing a new indie revival. And I think all these ideas of trying to to go back to newsprint and stuff, I think it's a good idea. What do you think about that, Mike?
Um, I think that there's a big indie revival going on right now, mostly on the crowdfunding site. Things like Richard Meyer's Iron Sights, Mike S. Miller's Lone Star, Ethan Van Sciver's Cyberfrog, and we're going to jump into it next spring with Cautionary Comics, with Offworlder and the Wraith. And I believe Cautionary is preparing to ship Ravager very shortly, which is written by Chuck Dixon. And I'm aware of a lot of other guys who are starting up about that. I'm excited about that. And I hope that these guys find a way to get their comics into regular distribution. I'm pretty sure that Mike Miller says that Diamond is going to distribute Lone Star. And my editor, my publisher, Ben Henderson, has said that he thinks he can get Diamond to distribute Cautionary Comics too.
Oh yeah, well, Ben Hennessy over at Cautionary Comics, he's doing quite a bit to try to help out and get some good books out there, and I certainly support everything he does.
Well, I sent you some art there. You might run that across the screen there for Offworlder. This is the first title we're doing next spring.
Yep,
Offworlder,
I got it up.
Is about a 7th century Scots warrior who's ripped out of his space and time by an alien race and transformed into a demigod to help them fight another alien race. It's real high concept space opera, science fiction stuff that Stanley used to do. And it's not like Stan because it's me, but that's the type of story it is, and it's going to be a lot of fun. The first script is done. And Jordi Armengol, there's a couple of examples of his art there. It's Offworlder, folks, not Offlander. But we're real stoked about it. The other one's going to be great, too. And I'm working on a couple other projects that I can't discuss yet. But it's all fresh, original stuff. And as with everything I do, the number one goal is to entertain.
Should be everyone's goal, really. I mean, to entertain.
It's the writer's first job.
Right.
So, looking at this Offworlder and listening to you describe it, this is the part where I squeal like a school. Space opera is absolutely my favorite genre of all time. Nexus, because at the time I was my EE docs, and so into Nexus, I love that whole space opera setup. And this is my jam. I'm going to stay plugged into this project here.
Yeah, I like any story that draws me in. Like, you start caring about the characters themselves and not just because, oh, look, they look like me, or anything like that. You don't match their identity. You just get drawn in and you start empathizing with whatever situation they're in. So if they're in a life or death situation, you suddenly are like, oh crap. It's kind of like Game of Thrones, where you get it invested in that character, and all of a sudden, axe to the head, and it's just like, no, you can't do that. And all of a sudden, Jon Snow, what does he come back as a zombie or something? I can't remember what happened to him, but he's like, left out when he died.
The secret to reader involvement is having them care about the characters.
Now, I have a question for you, Mike. Having written countless books for DC and Marvel, if you had a great story today, is there an open way for you to go to somebody and say, you know what, I'm pitching you this, or do you suffer any kind of ageism or anything like that?
Well, I'm not a whiner. It has been very difficult for me to find any comic book work for the past 20 years, but opportunities do arise. If I have an idea these days, I will pitch it to Dark Horse, uh, Aftershock, uh, and a couple of other shops that appear to be open to new ideas. But I talk to Dark Horse all the time, and they're struggling too. And Mike Richardson told me that the single issues are no longer selling like they used to. And when I say single issues, I mean like part of a 5-issue or a 6-issue run. The individual issues, that the money now is in trade paperbacks, which they can place in bookstores, and is the only area of the comics industry that's growing. But aside from that, we're not discussing the crowdfunding books. They're unique. They're something else, and some of them have proven enormously popular. Whether this will stretch on to other titles remains to be seen. But I see all sorts of stuff being crowdfunded, comic books crowdfunded, and some of them look exciting as hell. I mean, with just thoroughly professional art and intriguing storylines, but some of them are frankly amateurish. And there are a lot of people that are trying to raise money on crowdfunding. And then some people, they start a crowdfunder and they get a little money and they can't finish the project, and everybody's unhappy, and people who have invested are reluctant to do so again. So it's a mixed bag. It's really on the individual creators. As far as my future, I see it as I'm going to continue to create outside the normal channels, except when I have opportunities like Nexus, and Dark Horse is preparing a whole raft of new Nexus material. But the other stuff that I'm working on is probably going to be crowdfunded and going with small shops like Cautionary.
I got a question for you. That's not, it's a little off topic, I guess, but my question is this. What do you like to read yourself?
Well, I love crime novels. That's probably my favorite genre. I love history and biographies. I was just reading Newton Thornburg. He was a great writer of the 70s. He wrote Cutter and Bone, which was made into a movie called Cutter's Way, but it's not a great movie, but his books are great, especially To Die in California. Another great writer was William H. Hallahan, another great pulp writer of the 60s and 70s, and Herbert Lieberman, who wrote City of Fear.
Oh, yeah.
These days, I like Robert Harris a great deal. He's written a series of books about Cicero, the Russian lawyer. His last one was about Munich and an attempt to stave off World War II right on the eve. He's a historic writer, and I love him. And there's another historic writer named Con Iggulden, who's written a 6-book series on the life of Genghis Khan, which is one of the greatest things I've ever read in my life. If you pick it up, you're going to be on for the whole ride. It's more than 1 million words. And when I was done with that, I read his 6-novel series on Julius Caesar. This guy knows his history, and he brings it alive. He grabs the reader by the throat, which is my whole thing with whatever I write. My goal is to grab the reader by the throat and drag him, her, or it into the narrative so that they cease to think that they're experiencing a work of art and just experience it.
Yeah, I love the Julius Caesar run. I haven't read the Genghis Khan yet.
Yeah, well, then you know Khan.
Yes.
I might as well mention here that Liberty Island Press will publish my novel Disco at the end of this month, about a boy who adopts a mongrel pup and trains it to be world disc dog champion. It's a wholesome story for the whole family. I'm not joking. I'm not being ironic. And I think anybody who reads it will be delighted. It's not what I usually write, which are grim crime thrillers. Liberty Island is also going to release the 5th and 6th novels in my series Bad Road Rising, featured reformed motorcycle hoodlum Josh Pratt. And they're all available on Amazon. And the name of the first novel is Biker. If you just look for Biker by Mike Barron, it will lead to all the others. There are 4 out now. There will be 6 shortly, and I recently finished the 7th.
What got you inspired for the disc dog, the frisbee dog? I call it frisbee dog, but what inspired you to go down that path?
My dog. I had this old dog, and I'd take her to the park, and I'd throw the frisbee, and she'd run after it and leap up in the air, and I thought that was just great. And then my wife Ann, she can't read anything I write. It's all too grim. And for years, she'd been bugging me, say, "Why don't you write something I can read?" And so that was an inspiration as well. But I'd been thinking about this story for 20 years. And I just waited until I had the skills to do it. And I'm very happy with the results.
No, that's great. I worked for a football team, and that would be something we had, like, not every game, but it was like every third game we brought in a group that just had trick dogs in there. It was so fun to watch.
Yeah.
And everybody got into watching it. Like, normally you have people just leaving for halftime to go get snacks. More people stayed to watch that than anything else. We had live bands playing on some of the games, and the people just loved the interaction of the people with the dogs.
Yep. I do too. These present dogs I have, you're worthless, boys. They don't catch, they don't mind very well, but there are dogs.
Now, was this dog a border collie?
She was part border collie, in fact.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're known for this kind of thing, catching frisbees.
My dog sleeps really well.
They all do.
Yeah.
I saw that you like classic cars, hot rods, and everything. Do you have one that, like, if you had the time, inclination, skills, and all that, that you would like to rebuild yourself, or just kind of have somebody rebuild for you?
Oh, I'm not much of a mechanic. I do have 2 motorcycles. I can do basic maintenance, but that's about it. I just ride them.
Okay, speaking of motorcycles, have you seen The World's Fastest Indian?
Yeah, I love that movie.
Yeah, that was
Love that
fantastic.
Anthony Hopkins at his best.
That and Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah, that's a good one too. I love that. I love that movie though.
Now, I have a question, because we talked to, obviously our community is filled with new creators, and you talked about subpar product being brought to crowdfunding. But what kind of advice would you give writers? Give us your best advice for writers.
Well, there's a lot, but one thing I always say is every would-be writer has a million words of bullshit clogging up his system, and you have to get rid of that till you get to the good stuff. So it's important for writers to write. It's not to think about writing and dream about the story you're going to do, but actually set pen to paper every day. And it doesn't have to be a hard and fast rule. You can take Sundays off, you can take weekends off. But if you're not writing regularly throughout the week, I don't see how you can consider yourself a writer. There's so much more to it than that. The first lesson I have in my novel writing class is, what is your story about? And when somebody asks you that question, you have to be ready with an answer that's both succinct and intriguing. They don't want to hear you ramble on about orcs and beavers or stuff. For instance, I have a novel that's about Nazi biker zombies, and for a certain demographic, that's enough. Well, what's your novel about? It's about Nazi biker zombies. Enough said, sold, you know. Then there's apocryphal tale that Star Trek, that Gene Roddenberry had an elevator pitch, and it was Wagon Train in Space. And again, to a certain demographic, that's going to make sense, and they're going to want to do it. Now, some more, you're going to have to spell it out in a little more detail, like a whaling captain becomes obsessed with the whale that cost him his leg and spends the rest of his life tracking it down. But you need that hook. And again, I point to that video, 5 Guys in a Limo. 5 Guys in a Limo. Everybody look it up and watch it. It takes like 5 minutes, and that will give you an idea of how you should sound and how your stuff should read whenever you're trying to interest people in it.
I got a question for you in regards to writing. I'm actually writing on a project right now that 2 of the panelists are involved with as well. And a couple of the stories I'm working on are just, pretty standard comic book writing. But one of the stories, I just don't feel like it calls for a lot of dialogue. And it's more about the action and motion of what's happening panel to panel. And I've been kind of conflicted with myself if I should just leave the minimal dialogue, but then add little panels in. I mean, little letter blocks in various panels, telling this kind of background poetic. Man has been hunted. Our greatest thing we have accomplished is to remove ourselves from the food chain, etc. Stuff like that. I'm wondering, is it okay to write a story that has hardly any dialogue as a writer?
Sure it is. The first rule of writing is your job is to entertain. The second rule is to show, don't tell. And comics are a visual medium, and everything you can show without using dialogue, you should, and don't add the dialogue. If you watch Better Call Saul, that show excels in showing, not telling, and usually begins with a long wordless sequence that's just fascinating. The other side of that coin, though, unfortunately, is that wordless comic strips are a real fast read, so what should you do? Well, you can slow them down by adding dialogue and captions, but here's the thing, that dialogue and captions have to enhance the story. Now, some writers are so good with dialogue, like Shakespeare, and none of us are Shakespeare, that you're happy to hear his characters just chat and shoot the shit and say things back and forth, because there's all sorts of outrageous puns, and there's classic language which he created. So if you can create classic unforgettable language and put it in, and it adds to the story, do so. But most of the time it doesn't add to the story. So that's a tough one. It's a tough one, and I have a lot of stories that I've written where there's a lot of pages with no dialogue, but often they're fights. And we choreograph our fight sequences quite elaborately. But I've never written a wordless story, and I can't imagine doing so. Because to me, dialogue is part of the story. It may not be part of your story, and it doesn't have to be part of every story, but my stories are about characters, and characters reveal themselves through dialogue and sometimes advance the plot.
Well, it's not without dialogue. It's just extremely minimal.
Right.
But yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Think about it.
Yeah, that's actually what that's how I do everything, children's books and my stories, is that the art actually is telling the story just as much as I am. So I can tell you that I punched somebody, but if you see that, I don't have to describe the punch. You see exactly what happened, like you would in a movie. Except you can dictate exactly how somebody's head moves and everything along those lines.
Huh, good God.
You've written a few stories that have won you some awards. But do you have your own, is there a story of your own that's your favorite?
Oh man. Well, the Nexus, the Origin, these upcoming comics I have, I'm always striving to improve myself, and I'm happy to say that I feel that I'm getting better as a writer. So I'm always most excited about what I'm working on now, although I just recently stopped working on a novel because I wasn't feeling it. But the 4 Josh Pratt novels that I have out, I'm very proud of. And the reason is I was inspired to write by John D. MacDonald, and his character Travis McGee, who was kind of an ambling beach bum who helped people recover stolen property. But of course, there's a lot more to it than that. And Josh Pratt is my attempt to do a modern Travis McGee type character. He's a reformed motorcycle hoodlum who went to prison and found God and came out and tried to turn his life around. The only work he can get is delivering summons for sleazy lawyers. People keep coming to him with their problems because he knows how to get things done on a street level, an almost criminal level. He's a very quiet, modest man. He doesn't make speeches. He doesn't expound opinions, but you know him through his actions, which can be quite violent. I'm very happy with every Josh Pratt novel so far. And I'm happy with Disco. So, that's what I'm working on. And that's my best stuff to date, in my opinion. I also wrote a novel called Banshees, which is about a satanic rock band that returns from the dead. I'm very proud of that. That's my biggest novel. And if you like big, sprawling horror, like Robert R. McCammon or Stephen King, I think you'd like that.
That sounds actually pretty interesting. I'll have to check that one out. I feel the same way about something you just said. Is unfortunately when it comes to Ignition, I'm penciling, inking, and going to be coloring, and there's this thing I've always felt as the best page I'm doing is the one I'm doing at the moment, and I don't even want to look at those other pages. And now
Right.
I'm having to sort of pencil them, ink them real fast, and sort of get them out there and show some of them a little bit. And then eventually, by the time I get around to coloring them, I'm going to be like hating them. But it's such a
No, I don't think so.
it's such a tragic job in that sense that you always feel like the work you're doing right now is really the best you have because each page teaches you a lesson, or each book teaches you a lesson, or each novel that you've written teaches a lesson. And that's sort of a tricky thing when it comes to comics and doing them yourself, so to speak, is I have to hang with this work for a while. So every time I'm drawing a new page, I'm pulling up 2 or 3 pages that happened before it, so they make sure I get the blocking right, or make sure the flow of the story ends up right. So I'm always looking at pages going, oh my God, I should change this or change that. It must be a common theme for a lot of artists and a lot of creators.
Well, I don't know. I went for decades worrying about everything and not liking anything I wrote until about 10 years ago. And when well, I don't know if it was even 10 years, probably less. It seems longer. But when I was writing Banshees, I stopped. I said, holy shit, this is good stuff. And I didn't doubt it. And now I know what's good and what isn't. I have a real good sense. And so I never put anything out there about which I have doubts. If I put it out there, it's because I know it's good.
Mike, there's a question here from the chat from Denali. And he would like to know, what did you think of Chinatown and the Two Jakes?
Well, Chinatown is a masterpiece, and I've watched it over and over again. Forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown. As far as the Two Jakes, it's not a bad film. It has its merit, but it's no Chinatown.
Awesome.
Are we talking about the Two Jakes with Marlon Brando?
No,
Okay.
Jack Nicholson.
Oh, okay. Because there was an older movie, a western called The Two Jakes. Do you remember that even?
I think you're thinking of the Missouri Breaks. Oh no, Marlon Brando.
Right.
He did the Appaloosa.
There was this movie called The Two Jakes that I have on, what do they call that? VHS. That was really good. That sort of a cult classic in the sense that it's not shown on TMC.
Marlon Brando westerns. One-Eyed Jacks.
Oh, One-Eye Jacks. That's it. That's it.
One-Eyed Jacks. Yeah.
That's a really good movie.
It is a good movie.
So tell us a little bit more about Cautionary Comics. Now, is Cautionary Comics going to try to be a publisher or just sort of a house for the people involved?
No, it's a publisher. They're going to publish comics. The first one's Ravager, which will ship by the end of the year. That's Chuck's baby. But I think they're all based on Ben's concept. Ben Henderson, who's behind Cautionary Comics. And he's just a guy that has grown up loving comics and always wanted to do his own stories and publish his own books. But Ben recognizes that he's not a writer. He just wants to develop the concepts and let other writers flesh them out. And that's what we're doing.
So you guys won't be looking at outside books as far as being a publisher? But
first we got to make sure that the first 3 titles will fly. And to do that, we have to have a successful crowdfunder. And if it's successful, then we'll think about other stuff. But that's all in the future. Right now, we're doing the work now.
Right.
Well, you got Chuck Dixon and Mike Barron. I think that's a good start.
Oh, for sure, right?
Chuck's a terrific writer, and if you like hard-boiled fiction, his Levon Cade novels are fantastic. I actually got sick with jealousy while reading one and warned Chuck I might have to kill him because he writes so.
Yeah,
Now,
no, Chuck's amazing.
do you have anything else you'd like to announce or anything you'd like to tell the crowd here?
Not really. I hope to have something to announce shortly. I'll know more next week. But I have a series that I'm pitching to Dark Horse, which is, let me just say, it's about the James Bond of dogs. That's all. That's all I can say. The James Bond of dogs.
So is this a bipedal
Awesome.
character? Is that what you
No,
mean?
it's a dog.
Oh, okay. So it's not like Black Sad or anything like that.
No.
No, I got you. Oh wow, that's interesting.
No, it's Air Bud, but it's 007
It's Buddy McGill. He's
Buddy
a super
McGill.
party animal, and his name is Buddy McGill. With a
Sweet.
dry martini and a great big weenie, he'll give you something you can feel.
Ooh.
Hey, does anyone else have any more questions for Mike? Tank or Chris or?
All right, boys, it's been delightful. I'm
Yeah,
going to sign in
it's
now.
been great to have you. I want everyone to sort of close out with some, saying where they can find you.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, and most importantly, I'm on Amazon. If you type in Mike Barron, I have my own author page. Except, unfortunately, you got to get through 30 different comic book titles to get to my novels. I just want to mention Biker and Banshees, crime and science fiction, which anybody will love. They're highly addictive. I know how to grab readers by the throat. Once you start reading, you won't be able to put it down. And we are preparing a whole bunch of new Nexus material for Dark Horse to publish next year.
No, who's involved with that?
Well, Steve did the art, and I provided the guidelines.
Guidelines? You're not writing it?
Well, I did write it, but he rewrote everything.
Oh, Steve did?
Yeah.
Now, this is obviously you guys are friends, and the
Oh, yeah.
last time
We talk all the time. We
yeah.
talk all the time. I'm not happy about him rewriting me, but that was his call since he paid me to write the pages.
Oh, I get you.
Yeah.
Now, have you seen some artwork already?
Yeah. I got a whole bunch of the artwork. Steve, initially, he's been peddling it in these giant tabloid forms that are like 17 by 22 inches and are impossible to ship, which is why nobody's ever seen them. But all that stuff's going to be republished in a user-friendly format.
Right.
Friend, let's see. I got to go here, guys. I got to call.
Thanks for coming to join us, Mike. We'll close it out here.
Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Thanks,
we'll
Mike.
Talk later.
All right.
All right. So, anybody want to add anything about some of the things he said, or?
Well,
I
really. Oh, go right ahead.
No, that was it. I just like his hat.
You like his hat? Go ahead, Sam.
It is a nice hat. I really like how well developed and stories and the scenes and everything is just so well sculpted, and it shows a lot of care put into the product. So if anybody out there, Mike Barrett, seriously, you've been missing out. Treasure trove of awesome.
Yeah.
Mike's amazing.
One thing I'll add is that I went through his list of what he's written, and sort of picked out. Okay, I remember reading that. I don't think he's ever written anything that didn't grab me or was I would consider a bad story, or like, why did they pick Mike to do this? He wrote an issue of Conan. He's done some Teen Titans. For whatever reason, I was really into All-Star Squadron, and he did one issue with that, and I'm like, wait a second, let me go back and figure out what this issue is about. And when I looked at it, I'm like, oh my god, I remember that issue. So he's more prolific, and unfortunately probably does suffer from a little ageism because he's never written really anything bad. It's too bad he's not more involved in current comics.
No, Mike Barron is a very good writer. and he's also a very good interview, as you guys can see. He's very knowledgeable, and he has had a lot of experience and access to the comic book world. So it's really nice to have him on here. And when he does bring out those new things through Cautionary Comics, it would be really great to get him back and talk to him again.
Oh, for
Oh,
sure.
absolutely.
Yeah,
All right,
that's about it, man.
yeah, we're gonna close out here. Why doesn't everyone on the panel again talk about where they can be found, or what they're maybe the next thing? Obviously, Chess, you have something coming up in about what a half hour or hour
I
from
got
now.
in an hour. Of course, we have Bugbear's Basement, where today we will be talking about the Spotlight comic dealing on the Teen Titans with particularly Starfire, and it's the apartheid comic. So come over there and join us for that. That should be interesting and rather serious conversation. We'll try to. I don't know how much levity we'll be able to add to that, but we will try.
How about you, Chris? What are you working on? Why don't you talk a little bit about what's the last? I've retweeted it a few times. This is something I'm really proud of because I mean, even Mrs. Gaming the System is retweeting our stuff, and Chester makes a tweet, I retweet it. So this is something we got to keep up because imagine how many people saw the Apex drawing that you did. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Apex drawing? Who's your Apex drawing?
It was the Apex Predator, right? Thanks for joining us, Chris.
Yeah, it wasn't me. I don't draw. I can't draw or anything.
No, I asked you what. Tell us a little bit about Snow Leopard because this is a little bit of a different audience. I was giving you an avenue to.
Oh, I was trying to figure out what's going on with the Apex Predator. I was like, I don't know. I didn't draw nothing. More or less, what's going on with my internet? My internet's a little wonky, so sorry. I apologize. I'm with Tank. I'm in Tank's house right now, so that's what's going on.
He's
Why are
in the
you-
floorboards hiding.
No, I'm in the attic. Don't worry, you're fine.
Oh,
Who's your artist on the last Snow Leopard? Who are you
This
working with?
little known guy named John Dillard Gaming System. No one's ever heard of him. I grabbed him when he was just a little tot, and now he's a tater.
He's obviously all part of Tales from the Beyond the Gate, which Tank is
Yes.
involved and Chester's involved, and I'm also involved. And anyone listening, look for more announcements and more info coming about Tales of Beyond the Gate. Now, Tank, tell us about
yes.
you're gonna be you have a tweet about launching something on the 15th. What is it?
That's right. Well, on the 15th of December, I am launching my Indiegogo for Scalpel Zero, the first chapter in 2065 Retribution.
Gotta say,
Yep.
they're brave, very brave, because I have been told not to do this, wait till February by multiple people.
Yep.
Well,
It's
the
not a.
campaign concludes in February. It will be a 60-day campaign. It will conclude in February. But it's going to be a nice slow roller. We're going to get up some interest. We're going to watch the comic book come together before the campaign. People can.
Hopefully,
While you're.
everyone. Go ahead, Chester.
No. Tank's mic is really, really bad.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I hope everyone will
It's
come watch Tank
the
on some other shows, and maybe we can help him get some better equipment through some particular. Maybe you got a Patreon or anything you want to talk about. No, I got a bunch of chimps, and they type all
That's
my
right. The
stories.
chimpanzees, they're chewing on the wires. Yeah, no, they're yeah, I'm upgrading my equipment here shortly.
Oh, that's good because we
My
loved.
Wi-Fi is
Yeah. Wow.
yeah, my Wi-Fi is better than the rest of my devices.
We look forward to that day because we love having you interact with us and on the different shows, and I love being having you around when I'm around. It's always fun to talk to you, and we'll eventually give some shout outs about Tales Beyond the Gate coming up when we have more information about when we're going to Indiegogo. And when we put this project, I think we have all the creators already all set. All the art, people have already started working on it. All the writing's been worked on. So this is something that's coming up here pretty quick, but we'll give out more information about that. Chester, you have anything else you'd like to add?
Nope, nope.
Nope.
I think that was a good show, and I think we've come to the end.
All right, excellent. Bye, everyone. Thank you for coming.